And I can remember when it used to happen, thinking, even as little as I was, that he can hurt my body, but he can't hurt me. And I always had this sense of kind of being outside of myself, watching what was going on. And I don't know if he threatened me. I don't know why that I had to cover this up or hide it, but I do know that when I was sort of outside of myself, watching what was going on, I would think things like, oh, that is going to leave a bruise. I'll have to cover that up. I can't let Mom see that. Those kind of things. Hi. My name is Ian. Today we're talking about Elaine Lawless's Transformative Remembering, De-scribing the unspeakable in battered women's narratives. This is, even simply by the title, this is a hard article. Not hard article in terms of particularly complex or abstruse or theoretical, although there's definitely insight to be had from this that goes beyond the subject matter alone. But it's a hard article because it's speaking of the unspeakable, as the title suggests. But it's speaking of evil. I mean, we can use whatever words we wish, but fundamentally, it is the efforts at describing something that we recognize objectively as something that ought not be, clearly, something that has no rationale. We sometimes have explanatory models for why it happens based on economics, based on psychology, based on the entrenched sociology of gender and power dynamics. But objectivity or objective explanations are not what these narratives are about. They're about this intense subjectivity of experience. And they become these pivots between these experiences and, ironically, the need to express these things in a language of cool rationality and objectivity and quantifiability. Because as we're talking about personal experience narratives, we often are lucky in that the personal experiences of which we speak can be joyous ones, joyful ones, stories of triumph, stories of pleasure, stories of experiences of the senses that are sometimes enviable, stories of first kisses, stories of getting your driver's license, stories of your first week of university, all those sorts of things. So they're your stories, clearly, and they are nevertheless speak to this sort of universal form. They're patterns or traditions, even topicalities and so on, and all the things that we can talk about, adverting to Sandra Stahl's. And the community that is being built through the sharing of a personal experience narratives are often within that realm of communitas, of mutual co-presence that is joyful. Sometimes we have to give voice to experiences that are not of that kind. One of the things that Lawless, she doesn't use these words, but I don't think I would be incorrect by suggesting that this is one of the things that's happening, is that when we're talking about these unspeakable acts, these acts of what we might call surds, incomprehensibilities that nevertheless we know to have happened. The first audience of the personal experience narrative is often the self. That there is something about giving voice to experience. First off, that is about processing the experience for yourself, not simply the communication of other, although it speaks to the idea that since we have narrative as a device, and since we have a tradition of taking experiences and rendering them into narratives, communicating them for whatever purpose, the very act of giving voice to these is an act of our own understanding. It's not even to the point of having someone else understand. We render experience into image. We render experience into something that can be parsed ourselves. It's almost like, I want to say it's almost like doodling, but of course that immediately undermines the import of that act. But it's just taking it and turning it into something that we could then subsequently employ some kind of hermeneutic. All right, I'm going to establish character. I'm going to establish timeline. I'm going to establish something approaching motives. And I'm certainly going to establish a list of actions. And so we have this as this device. And when Lawless talks about all her experience as a volunteer in shelters for battered women, one of the things that she refers to is this active narrative, the role that narrative plays in these communities. And these are communities that are bound by crisis, clearly. And there is no demand that people give voice. It's not like a condition of being there. Rather, it is the self-therapeutic that has emerged within these contexts, in that I need to say what is happening. And I need to hear what has happened to someone else. And that in combination, and people who have not simply told their story, but retold their story, this retelling of the story, sometimes in personal experience narrative, we talk about that, well, we're turning, the first flush might be the effort, the initial translation into the conventions of narrative, and then the subsequent retellings are all about making a better story. But making a better story is often about making something more comprehensible, and it isn't about the aesthetics of having retold one story are about increasing comprehensibility, about increasing it being more and more clearly understandable. And again, not simply to a third party, not simply to an audience, but to the self. And so hearing other people's stories, I presume, and again, I can only clumsily work my way through this, because while I hope you grasp that my empathy is full, I haven't had this experience. I've been privileged not to have this experience, so I can really only reflect on what others have said. But I would imagine, and I'm speaking from not analogous in import, but analogous enough of my own experiences, that there is something to be said about the power of hearing someone else's experiences, to let one know that despite the singularity of the event, it is perhaps tragically, it is not a unique occurrence in the history of human interaction. It might be tragic that it is not, but at least I am not doing this alone, or at least that it is not something that is entirely wholly known to me, so that I do have at least the hope of a vocabulary of speaking about this. Because if the first flush of these narratives is this sort of therapeutic aspect, there are two additional thrusts. And one of them is complex and problematic. I mean, problematic in terms of what we understand as being the role of the teller and the commitment the teller has to their own experiences when giving voice. That sentence made sense in my head, so hopefully I can unpack it. Because the first thing that Lawless talks about is, again, this issue of the untellable. This issue of the problem with these narratives is that they do not always meet our criteria for narrative fluency, because there are silences, because there are actions that remain unspoken. A coarse analogy, but allow me it. If you were telling a fairy tale, a Märchen, and you omitted the scene where the hero slays the dragon, there would be something absent in that telling, because it needs the conclusion. We think in terms of narrative arcs, and we think in terms of the narrator has an obligation for some kind of completion. And what happens is that when one is speaking of one's own experiences, and one is speaking of these experiences of violence and trauma, they are desperately difficult to give voice to. In part because they are about a loss, not a loss of they are about a loss of what one expects the world to be. That, again, they are unthinkable. They cannot be parsed through the notion of natural consequence, because they are about, again, I'll use the word evil. They are surds. They are unintelligible, and yet we know them to be true. So these stories are often filled with silences, and these silences happen at precisely the moment of the key occurrences. We'll have narratives of domestic abuse that have the before and have the after and don't describe the during, because that's indescribable, because that is not, words fail us. And she has this wonderful expression towards the end. The narratives break down where language breaks down. This is a failure of language, not a failure of the storyteller. There are no words. But here's the complex, is that personal experience narratives and testimony are interrelated genres. And you can make an argument that the difference between them is notional, although personal experience narratives, as we said, often go into, often become anecdotes. They become sort of these pleasurable items in a person's repertoire. And they're told for means of constructing the self and constructing the self in relation to a community, both joyous ones and tragic ones. And we'll get back to that in a second. But sometimes you need to tell your experiences to these outer gatekeepers, the people that I talked about earlier. The idea that we can understand domestic violence in terms of statistics, in terms of causes, in terms of this objective reality. And we need to convert our subjective experience into something that is commensurate with that in a very instrumental way. We have to do things first, like argue for restraining orders. One of the very first things one needs to do if one is able to escape the cycle of violence. And elsewhere, Lawless talks about the cycle of violence as a theme in narrative. But if one's able to get to the shelter, to leave the home hopefully with whatever children may or may not be in the picture. But if there are children, hopefully leave them, remove oneself from the domestic aggressor. And then ask for the weight of the state, of police, of the judiciary, to help that separation be maintained by putting a stay, an order of some description on the aggressor. And you cannot be within, you cannot be in contact. You must stay away. You need to argue for why. And you need to argue for why in a way that fits the expectations of the audience of that objective reality. So you need to give voice. You need to say what happens. And that's where you have that failure of language. That's where you have these broken narratives, these narratives that don't work because they don't fulfill our idea of narrative competency, but it's because they are dealing with events where voice is so difficult and voice fails us. So then we have this impasse. And we're thinking of now when to turn these narratives into instrumental things. That there's a transactional nature to this. If this is again a coarse way of saying it, but the courts, the police are fundamentally saying, if your narrative fits our expectations of fluency and competency to the point where we believe, or at least we can extend the benefit of the doubt, if not necessarily fully convinced, that the events that you described happened, then we can bring the full weight of the state into it. And, bringing the full weight of the state into it is a big ask. But that ask is now entirely, the demonstration of evidence is now entirely on the shoulders of the woman who has had, either immediately or for long periods of time, these experiences where words fail. So, all of a sudden, you now need to develop narrative competency and narrative fluency. And they do. And there are people there who help them with their stories, who help them frame their experiences into something that is more approaching the level of tellability, if only not for the therapeutic reasons, but for meeting the expectations of these gatekeepers of the state, who might be sympathetic, but still need to justify how they wield their power. And so, that's what happens in shelters. That's what happens in advocacy groups. That's what happens with volunteers, is that they assist people, women, first and foremost, with their stories. Let's see if we can figure out what happened. And it's this double bind, because it's fundamentally that issue of believe women. We believe you. Yet, you need to have your experience align with our expectations. And so the narrative becomes a complicated thing. Now, I said there were two trajectories, and one was the instrumentality. And the second is ownership. Because one of the things that she ends the article with is these sort of various half-lives of these stories. And that as they are told, as they are retold. And fundamentally, this really happens when the issue has been as resolved as an issue like this can be resolved. When it is now a thing of the past. Doesn't mean that the trauma is gone. It doesn't mean that the scars aren't there. But there's a sense of closure. That really one of the things that's happening in the first flushes of narrative is that as they're escaping that cycle of violence, the real world hasn't hit a satisfactory conclusion, so how can the narratives hit a satisfactory conclusion? I use satisfactorily, not glibly, but perhaps casually. But when time has passed, and when these women tell their stories again, and now they're telling them as stories, not as entertainments, but as stories, as something that they recognize has a beginning, a middle, and an end, something that they recognize has narrative fluency, something they recognize has characters and motivations and arcs and all the things that we look for in a narrative, no matter how true, or that they also affirm, and we affirm that these narratives are. There is a remove there. And one of the things that she notes is how there are these tiny little indications that the character, follow me on this, that the character of the victim of domestic violence in domestic violence narratives at this stage and the narrator are not one of the same, not one and the same, sorry. They are biographically contiguous, but they are not the same person insofar as that is who I was. That is not who I am. And so there is an emancipatory aspect of it. And it doesn't mean that the trauma is ended. It means that the circumstances are concluded. And the transformative experience, however one wished that transformative experience had not happened, a transformative experience has fundamentally changed that person, and they have survived. So they are, oddly, triumphant narratives because they reaffirm the integrity of the individual, the integrity of the person, and the ongoing strength and resilience of the person. And one of the ways that's demonstrated, ironically, is through narrative fluency. That they own their story, that they have control over their story. They don't have control over the events. They didn't have control over the events. That is the nature of these things. And at first flush, they had only the loosest control over the narrative of those events, because it's a process. And at the final stage, they do have ownership of the events, control over the narrative of the events, the lessons, explicit and implicit both, that they have learned from these events. Yeah. So Lawless introduced this concept, more or less single-handedly, of tellability and untellability, and listening to silences, listening to when narratives break down. Because, again, we put on our privileged folklorist's hat, and we hear a story, that's missing details, that's scattered, that's not a good story. And as narrative scholars, we don't know what to do with that, save for say that's not a good story and walk away again. But as people, we need to look for the silences. We need to look for fractured and broken narratives, because just because words fail us, just because it's a failure of language, doesn't mean that there isn't value to be had from trying to give the space and the time to slowly ease that experience into words. Because it's, whether through instrumental or whether it is through the slightly less instrumental in terms of convincing the courts, or the different instrumentality of rebuilding a community for this person, for all, that might have this as their shared experience, as a motivating shared experience, that might define them as a group but doesn't define them ultimately as people. That is something that they can move away from. Other people have used tellability and untellability in other forms of particular traumas, people who've survived disasters, so Katrina narratives, 9/11 narratives. I imagine there's going to be COVID narratives that also speak of the untellability. Maybe because this is so protracted and we're hearing these narratives, we always have this language is emerging as we speak. Asylum narratives, migration, immigration, and particularly the more traumatic versions of that. Tellability is a concept. And so on one hand, this is about things that it might seem at first callous to discuss in the same breath as we're talking about lighter, fun anecdotes. And certainly it might be seem at first callous to talk about them in the same breath as we're thinking about fictional narratives like Märchen or jokes. But it is at its core about the rendering of experience into words, perhaps at its most necessary. But more than this, we know how to express events into narrative, events into words, to communicate them, to share them, in part because we live in a world that is so narrative driven, including those seemingly disparate genres of Märchen and even joke. We are narratively fluent, and sometimes we need to return to our narrative fluency competencies when they will fail us most, but that is what we need. Yeah. So, Lawless does important work. This is an important article. I don't have the personal strength to do it its entirety of justice, but hopefully as you read this, it resonates somehow. Hopefully as you read this, desperately hopefully as you read this, it isn't bringing up some of your own traumas and experiences. I hope that isn't the case. I hope that isn't the case, that you have them, let alone that this will do it. But yeah, again, a failure of language. I'm reasonably competent in speaking, but it's Wittgensteinian, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. So I'm going to stop now. As ever, I just wish you the best. Take care.